The downfall at Forrester Creations did not arrive as a single dramatic collapse. It unfolded instead like a series of quiet fractures that only became visible once the structure was already compromised. What had begun as emotional betrayal, as hidden manipulation and exposed secrets, slowly transformed into something more dangerous: professional sabotage disguised as personal survival. For Ivy Forrester, the realization came in stages. First, there was denial, then resistance, and finally, acceptance, not of guilt, but of consequence. She understood that within the Forrester ecosystem, forgiveness was rarely guaranteed, and reputation, once damaged, rarely restored itself without cost. The exposure of her actions toward Electra Forrester had not only damaged trust within the family, but it also shifted how others within the company viewed her presence. She was no longer seen as a stabilizing force or even a controversial one. She was now seen as a liability. R.J. Forrester, meanwhile, found himself in a similar position, though for different reasons. His involvement in the emotional fallout surrounding Electra and Will Spencer had already placed him in a complicated space within the company's internal dynamics. What he had once interpreted as loyalty and romantic protection was now being reframed by others as emotional impulsivity tied to poor judgment. The foundation of his credibility within the creative environment was beginning to weaken, not in obvious ways, but through subtle exclusions from decision-making spaces, reduced influence in design discussions, and quiet recalibrations of trust. It was in this environment of growing insecurity that Ivy made her move. She did not approach RJ with hesitation. She approached him with clarity. The conversation between them did not begin as a conspiracy. It began as fear. Fear of being erased from a company they both believed they had contributed to in meaningful ways. Fear of becoming disposable in a system that valued legacy but punished deviation from it. Ivy spoke first of opportunity, of ownership, of control over their own creative future. She framed it not as rebellion, but as necessity. RJ listened. At first, he resisted the idea. His connection to the Forrester name, despite its complications, still carried emotional weight. But Ivy's argument did not rely on sentiment alone. It relied on vulnerability. She reminded him of how quickly trust within the company had shifted, how easily influence could be withdrawn, how their roles, once assumed secure, had become conditional. And then she introduced the idea that changed everything. If they stayed, they would always be reacting. If they left, they could begin defining. The concept of independence, once abstract, began to take shape in RJ's mind not as betrayal, but as escape. And in Ivy's mind, escape was only the first stage. The second stage was competition. What began as discussion gradually evolved into planning. Not impulsive planning, but structured, deliberate coordination. They identified what they believed to be vulnerabilities within Forrester Creations, not in terms of design philosophy, but in terms of intellectual property. Ideas that had not yet been fully implemented. Concepts still in development. Creative directions that existed in transitional form, not yet protected by finalization. And from there, the decision was made. They would take what they believed had been built with their contribution and establish something separate. Something that could not be controlled, corrected, or dismissed by the Forrester hierarchy. What neither of them fully acknowledged in that moment was the moral shift occurring beneath the surface of their justification. What they were framing as independence was, in practice, extraction. What they were calling innovation was, in legal terms, appropriation. But at the time, those distinctions felt secondary to survival. The actual breach did not happen loudly. It happened quietly, in the hours where oversight was minimal and digital access was assumed to be routine. Files related to upcoming seasonal collections, concept sketches, material specifications, digital renderings, and strategic presentations were accessed, duplicated, and removed from internal visibility systems. There was no immediate alarm, no instant detection, only absence. It was Steffi Forrester who noticed first. At first, It appeared to be a technical issue. Missing files were not unheard of in digital environments, especially within large creative firms where constant iteration meant constant revision. But as she investigated further, the pattern became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Entire clusters of intellectual property had been erased or transferred in ways that did not align with standard operational procedures. And more importantly, there was evidence of unauthorized access. Steffi's reaction was not emotional. It was strategic, because in that moment, the issue was no longer about internal conflict. It was about corporate integrity. Intellectual property theft was not simply a violation of trust. It was a direct threat to the company's competitive position in an industry where innovation defined survival. When an internal audit confirmed the breach, the conclusion was immediate and unambiguous. R.J. Forrester and Ivy Forrester had accessed, extracted, and removed proprietary creative material. The response was not delayed. Termination was issued without negotiation. Legal action followed almost immediately. The decision to file suit was not framed as punishment. It was framed as protection. Forrester Creations could not afford to signal tolerance for internal exploitation of its creative assets. In the fashion industry, ideas were currency, and once compromised, they could not be recovered. But by the time the legal machinery began to move, Ivy and RJ were already gone. They did not remain to face confrontation. They did not remain to justify their actions. Instead, they exited the system entirely, stepping out of the corporate structure before it could fully contain them. Their departure was not marked by apology or reflection. It was marked by declaration. And that declaration changed the trajectory of everything that followed. They would not disappear. They would compete. The announcement of a new independent brand, built in direct opposition to Forrester Creations, was not subtle. It was intentional. It was framed not as retreat, but as challenge. Not as escape, but as confrontation. For Ridge Forrester, the impact was not merely professional. It was deeply personal, because this was not simply about intellectual property or corporate rivalry. This was about lineage, about trust, about the assumption that even in conflict, family boundaries would remain intact enough to prevent total rupture. That assumption was now broken, and in its place was something far more destabilizing. Betrayal with structure behind it. A betrayal that had moved from emotion into execution. The emotional weight of it spread quickly through the family system. Ridge did not respond with immediate anger in public, but internally, the fracture was unmistakable. This was not just about Ivy and RJ leaving. It was about what they took with them. Not just ideas, but confidence. Not just designs, but control over narrative. Because in launching a competing brand, they were not only leaving Forrester Creations, they were challenging its authority. The legal response, while swift, could not undo the immediate symbolic damage. The lawsuit ensured that the conflict would move into courtrooms, negotiations, and prolonged legal scrutiny. But it could not erase the fact that two individuals who had once been part of the creative core of the company were now positioned as external competitors. And competition, in this industry, rarely remains civil for long. What followed was not simply a business dispute. It became a war of perception. Media attention intensified. Industry speculation grew. Analysts questioned whether Forrester Creations was beginning to fracture from within. Investors sought reassurance. Designers within the company began to reassess internal stability. Every decision, every collection preview, every strategic announcement now carried the shadow of external opposition led by individuals who once operated inside the system. RJ and Ivy, despite their departure, were no longer absent. They were present in every conversation about risk. But beneath the corporate consequences, there remained something more complex: emotional contradiction. RJ was not universally condemned internally, because his history within the company was still layered with personal connections and creative contributions. Some viewed his departure as betrayal. Others viewed it as misdirection under pressure. But none could fully separate his actions from the emotional turmoil that had preceded them. Ivy, however, carried a different burden. Her earlier manipulation of Electra Forrester had already damaged her credibility within the family system. The escalation into corporate sabotage only reinforced the perception that her actions, regardless of intent, consistently moved toward control rather than collaboration. Yet even within that condemnation, there remained a difficult truth that no one could fully ignore. Ivy believed she was acting from conviction. And conviction, even when destructive, is not easily dismantled. Steffi Forrester understood this more clearly than most. Her response to the breach was not only procedural, but philosophical. She recognized that allowing internal betrayal to remain unanswered would weaken the company's structural authority. But she also understood that escalating the conflict into prolonged public warfare would carry its own cost. That tension between enforcement and containment became the new internal struggle. Legal teams prepared for litigation. Design teams adjusted to the loss of creative continuity. Leadership recalibrated messaging. And beneath all of it, an unspoken awareness settled across the company. The damage was no longer limited to what had been taken. It now extended to what had been lost. Trust, stability, and the assumption that internal bonds could prevent external fragmentation. Outside the company, Ivy and RJ began constructing their identity not from what they left behind, but from what they opposed. Their brand positioning was deliberate. It was framed around independence, disruption, and rejection of inherited constraint. But beneath that branding was something more fragile, the need to justify rupture as progress. Because without justification, their actions would collapse under their own weight. And yet, even as they moved forward, the shadow of Forrester Creations remained present in every strategic decision. Not as inspiration, but as reference point. Everything they built was defined in relation to what they had left. Meanwhile, within the Forrester family, Ridge faced a quieter but more enduring consequence. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a question of legacy. If those closest to the creative core could fracture and leave with proprietary vision, then what did that say about the integrity of the system itself? The lawsuit would proceed. The brand war would escalate. And the industry would watch as two opposing forces, one established, one emerging from its own foundation, collided in a prolonged struggle for relevance, identity, and control. But beneath all of that, the emotional truth remained unchanged. This was not simply about stolen designs. It was about people who once belonged to the same system deciding that belonging was no longer enough. And once that decision is made, nothing within that system can remain untouched. The legal war between Forrester Creations and the newly formed brand led by Ivy Forrester and RJ Forrester did not erupt overnight into chaos. It evolved into something far more exhausting and far more personal, a slow, grinding conflict that infiltrated every corner of their lives, turning ambition into obsession and innovation into a battlefield of reputation. At first, Ivy and RJ believed they were stepping into freedom. Freedom from control. Freedom from hierarchy. Freedom from the emotional and structural weight of the Forrester name. But freedom, they quickly discovered, was not the absence of pressure. It was the presence of consequence without protection. Their new brand launched with deliberate defiance. The aesthetic direction was bold, almost aggressive in its attempt to differentiate itself from Forrester Creations. Every design choice carried an implicit message. This is not inheritance. This is rebellion. Ivy positioned herself as the strategic mind behind the operation, while RJ attempted to anchor the creative identity of the brand in something emotionally relatable, something that still carried traces of the Forrester artistic language, but reinterpreted through independence. Yet no matter how far they tried to distance themselves, the shadow of Forrester Creations followed. In boardrooms, analysts referred to them not as innovators, but as defectors. In industry circles, their brand was not introduced as a new force, but as an offshoot. Even their earliest supporters framed their success in terms of opposition rather than originality. And within that subtle reframing lay the first crack in their foundation. Because what Ivy and RJ had underestimated was not talent, but perception. Forrester Creations did not need to actively destroy them. It only needed to remain established. Stability itself became a form of pressure. Meanwhile, inside Forrester Creations, Ridge Forrester carried a different burden. The weight of having lost not only intellectual property, but emotional continuity within his own creative lineage. The breach had not just been financial or legal. It had been symbolic. It suggested that even within the most protected creative environment he had built, trust could be converted into extraction. Steffi Forrester, now leading the corporate response with precision, ensured that the legal case against Ivy and RJ moved forward aggressively. The lawsuit was structured not only around damages, but around precedent, a clear statement that internal betrayal of intellectual property would not be tolerated, regardless of familial connection. But even as legal teams constructed their arguments, something unexpected began to surface in the cultural aftermath of the scandal. Interest. The industry, always hungry for disruption, began to shift its attention toward the very conflict that was meant to discredit Ivy and RJ. What was intended as a cautionary tale was gradually reframed by outsiders as a narrative of rebellion against legacy power structures. And that reframing created a dangerous contradiction. Because while Forrester Creations saw betrayal, parts of the public saw defiance. While Ridge saw violation of trust, some saw the birth of competition. And in that tension, Ivy found something she had not anticipated, a tension that could be transformed into legitimacy if controlled correctly. But control, as she was beginning to learn, was no longer simple. It was contested. The most immediate internal instability within the new brand did not come from legal pressure, but from emotional divergence. RJ, despite his initial conviction, began to feel the psychological weight of what they had done. The excitement of independence slowly gave way to the realization that their success would forever be measured against the institution they had left behind. Every creative decision felt like an implicit comparison. Every setback felt amplified by the expectation that they were supposed to prove something larger than design capability. Ivy, on the other hand, adapted differently. Where RJ began to question, Ivy began to reinforce. She doubled down on strategy, on narrative control, on positioning their brand not as a reaction, but as a correction of what she believed Forrester Creations had become complacent about. In her mind, the conflict was not just professional, it was ideological. She was not simply building a company. She was challenging a system, and systems, she believed, only changed under pressure. That divergence between them, RJ's emotional instability and Ivy's ideological rigidity, became the first internal fault line in their partnership. But neither of them acknowledged it openly. Not yet. Outside their newly formed brand, Forrester Creations was preparing for a different kind of response. Not reactive, but structural. Steffi and Ridge understood that direct confrontation alone would not be sufficient. The legal system would address theft, but it would not address influence. And influence was what Ivy and RJ were beginning to build. So the strategy shifted. Instead of merely defending, Forrester Creations began reinforcing its identity publicly. Campaigns were restructured. Upcoming collections were positioned not just as fashion statements, but as reaffirmations of legacy. The message was subtle but consistent. Continuity matters more than disruption. And beneath that messaging was an unspoken warning to the industry. Stability still holds power. But while corporate strategy unfolded above ground, beneath it another emotional current was developing, one that neither side fully controlled. Electra Forrester, still processing the earlier cascade of betrayals within the family system, found herself observing the emergence of Ivy's new identity with a mixture of detachment and unresolved tension. Ivy had once been a personal threat to her emotional life. Now she was becoming a professional adversary in a much larger conflict. That transformation did not erase the past. It complicated it. RJ, too, occupied a liminal space in Elektra's perception. He was no longer simply a partner or a participant in past emotional entanglements. He had become part of a structural opposition, someone whose choices now carried consequences beyond personal relationships. And that realization forced Elektra into a different kind of emotional maturity, one where affection and accountability could no longer be separated cleanly. Meanwhile, Ivy and RJ's brand faced its first real external pressure point when a major industry investor, previously neutral, began questioning the legal stability of their operations due to ongoing litigation. This was not a public rejection, but a private hesitation. And hesitation in business is often more damaging than refusal. Funding projections slowed. Expansion plans paused. Internal confidence began to erode in ways that could not be immediately reversed. RJ interpreted this as confirmation of their vulnerability. Ivy interpreted it as proof of necessity for stronger narrative aggression. Neither interpretation resolved the problem. Instead, it deepened their divide. It was during this period of instability that a critical incident occurred, one that did not originate from courtrooms or boardrooms, but from public perception. A leaked internal document from Forrester Creations, unrelated to the theft case but connected to upcoming design strategy, surfaced online. It contained early conceptual direction for a seasonal collection that bore conceptual similarities to elements already appearing in Ivy and RJ's public previews. The leak created immediate controversy. Accusations began circulating from both sides. Forrester Creations insisted it was a coincidence of overlapping industry trends. Ivy and RJ's brand suggested it was evidence of continued dominance and indirect influence. Analysts debated whether the similarities were intentional, coincidental, or symbolic. But the most damaging effect was not clarity, it was confusion. Because in confusion, narrative control becomes fragmented, and fragmented narratives are difficult to stabilize. Inside Ivy and RJ's organization, the leak was interpreted differently by each of them. RJ saw it as escalation they were not prepared for. Ivy saw it as opportunity. She believed that conflict, when sustained, eventually normalizes opposition. And once opposition becomes normal, legitimacy follows. But what she underestimated was fatigue. Not just organizational fatigue, but emotional fatigue between partners operating under constant pressure. RJ began questioning not only strategy, but direction. He started to wonder whether they were building something sustainable or simply reacting to something they could never fully surpass. Ivy, sensing this shift, attempted to reinforce conviction through certainty. She framed doubt as weakness and hesitation as regression. But in doing so, she unintentionally created distance. And distance, in high-pressure partnerships, is often the first visible sign of structural failure. Meanwhile, Forrester Creations began preparing for a decisive legal phase. Discovery processes were intensified. Digital records were reconstructed. Witness testimonies were compiled. And Steffi ensured that every procedural step reinforced one central narrative. This was not rivalry. This was violation. But even as legal machinery advanced, Ridge remained privately unsettled, not by the loss itself, but by what it represented. The idea that creative lineage could fracture and reassemble itself into opposition suggested that Forrester Creations was no longer just a family legacy. It had become a contested ecosystem, and contested ecosystems do not remain static. They evolve, or they collapse. As the first court hearing approached, both sides prepared not just evidence, but identity. Forrester Creations prepared to defend continuity. Ivy and RJ prepared to defend disruption. But beneath those surface narratives, something more fragile was unfolding on both sides. Uncertainty about whether either interpretation was fully sustainable. Because in the end, this was no longer a conflict about stolen designs or broken trust. It was about whether legacy could survive reinterpretation, and whether those who leave legacy behind ever truly escape its reach. The answer, as both sides are beginning to understand, was